So I'm here to talk about the NOVA food classification system. This is the outline of my presentation. I'll start by explaining the rationale underlying NOVA. NOVA is a tool, but underlying NOVA, there's a theory, right? So I will give some elements of this theory for you during the rationale. Then I'll describe the classification. We'll see some uses and applications that occur in the last 10 years, and some developments and improvements. So the first question is why we need a food classification based on food processing. Of course, one health-oriented food classification. Traditional classifications, they group foods according to the nutrient content, right? You have protein-rich foods, you have proteins are a source of vitamins and minerals, etc. But why make sense to have a classification based on food processing? There are several reasons. I'll start by the most basic reason. That is the fact that today, in the 21st century, the content of critical nutrients in the diet, I mean sodium, sugar, saturated fat, trans fats, protein, fiber, these critical nutrients in the diet are there in smaller or greater amount depending on food processing. Excessive sodium or sugar in the diet, they don't come from the sugar and sodium that exist in the natural foods. They are done by adding these substances to the food. So this is the first reason. But there are others. Because it's not just nutrient. What the modern nutrition science knows today is that nutrients is just a part of the components of a food that can influence health. What are these other health-relevant food attributes that are influenced also by food processing that influence health? First, the presence of non-nutrient health protective food components. We know probably around 60 or 70 nutrients, but the foods, they contain hundreds of bioactive chemical compounds that can influence health. Recently, I read something about garlic. So only in garlic, we know more than 300 chemical compounds that are not counted as nutrients, and they have antioxidant and other properties. Second reason within this second reason, the integrity of the food matrix or the molecular relationship between nutrients and non-nutrients within a food, it's also important for health. So this means that the whole food, one whole food is more than the sum of their components. And why is that? Because you have synergies. So flavonoids interact with the fiber and that they are absorbed in different ways depending if the fiber belongs to the food in the intact matrix, or if the fiber is added to a component. So the synergism that we know just a little bit, but of course can be influenced by food processing. Some types of food processing, they destroy the food matrix. Then still can have in your product fiber, protein, carbohydrates, sometimes in the same proportion they were in the whole foods, but now they are separate. They lose the synergies. Another important thing, and all of these I'm telling you, probably in the last century, it exists, but it was much less important because food processing changed its nature in the last decades. I will tell you more about this. But the presence of contaminants, and here I'm not talking about contaminants, bacteria or microorganisms. I'm talking about contaminants such as additives. So what are additives? Additives are, by definition, are chemical compounds that don't belong to food, that are added to products with some purpose, but they are strange to our bodies. In this case, they can be grouped in a big group of xenobiotics. Xenobiotics is everything you put in your body that your body is not adapted, is not used to get these chemical compounds. There are some molecules that are released from packaging, like phthalates, for instance, that, again, related to food processing, and some new formed substances. So depending on the intensity of temperature and pressure, you can produce things like acrylamide, for instance, which are, again, substances that are related to health. And finally, texture, energy density, palatability, thermic effect, glycemic index. There are several attributes in foods that can influence health that are not counted as nutrients. And finally, eating patterns, how, when, where food is eating. These eating patterns also are influenced by food processing. Here, I'm referring particularly to our ability to control energy balance. So depending on where, when, how you are eating, your ability to regulate energy balance can be changed. And this can be changed by food processing. So if you eat natural foods or if you eat highly processed foods. The view that healthy diets should be based on unprocessed or minimally processed food and restricted in highly processed food is, I would say, that's now practically consensual. This document from 2019, I think, FAO-WHO meeting that discussed principles of healthy diets. Then you can see at a certain point in this document that healthy diets are based on a great variety of unprocessed or minimally processed foods, balanced across food groups, while restricting highly processed food and drink products. This is a consensus. What is not a consensus is what are minimally processed foods? What are highly processed foods? That was the reason to develop NOVA. So NOVA, for the first time, it seems absurd, this situation, right? So something so important that until recently, before NOVA, we didn't have a classification for minimally processed foods. Minimally processed foods were taken as something obvious, that everybody knows what are minimally processed foods, and the same thing for highly processed. There was no classification. So NOVA came to fulfill this gap. I will not go into such a detail on the novel food classification system, first because I think many of you know already the classification. There are papers that describe the classification in detail. So, but I'll give you some important, more relevant information about NOVA. First of all, NOVA is based on food processing, but not in any feature of food processing, but specifically on the extent and purpose of food processing, of industrial food processing. So NOVA doesn't deal with culinary preparations. So if you prepare something at home, it's a culinary preparation, so it's not industrial processing. This is first thing important. According to the extent and purpose of food processing, industrial food processing, NOVA divides foods in just 4 groups. So everything we eat, in theory, we could classify as group 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? In group 1, we have what we could call fresh or unprocessed or minimally processed food. NOVA puts them together because it's difficult to separate. I mean, when you just clean a carrot, is it minimally processed, is unprocessed? It doesn't matter. I mean, it's the same thing, belongs to the same group. What are these minimally processed foods? Fresh foods, of course, are edible parts of plants and animals after separation from nature. So if you just take in the nature a carrot and you clean a carrot, you have an unprocessed food, right? But if you go beyond cleaning or separating some undesired parts, if you dry, if you grind, if you ferment, if you pasteurize, then you are applying minimal processes, right? So in the first group, we have all fruits and vegetables. We have packaged rice, dried and packaged rice, oat, milk, meat, frozen frozen, fermented milk, everything goes into group 1, which is important. That's in group 1, these foods, they do not receive either salt or sugar or fat, just the food. It's, in most cases, just one ingredient. I mean, or they don't have actually a list of ingredients, because it does make to get apple and say this contains 1 apple, right? But sometimes you have this. You have a label say apple ingredient. And sometimes you have 2, you have a granola, for instance, you can have 3 or 4 or 5 different foods, but they are not added of salt, sugar, anything. The second group is very important in Nova because it's a highly processed product. I'm talking here about oils, fats, sugar, honey, salt. These are processed culinary ingredients. Here comes the purpose thing. The purpose in the first group essentially is prolonged duration of foods. So if you pasteurize a milk, you get more duration, you get more safety in your product. But in group 2, they are highly processed in a way that the product, butter, is very different from milk, right? Olive oil is very different from olives, because they are just one part of the food which is extracted and used as a culinary ingredients. So these foods are highly processed, but they are not consumed by themselves. They don't replace foods. On the contrary, they are used to consume, to facilitate preparation of group 1 foods. So instead of considering this group as many times, if you see the traditional food pyramid, you see sometimes salt, sugar, and fat at the top. And the orientation is used sparingly. If you cook, I mean, and if you use cooking oil sparingly, you don't cook, actually, right? If you don't use salt, how you can cook? But that's the second group. So this was the first small revolution that Nova did. I mean, so even table sugar is considered a processed culinary ingredient, right? Then I'll tell you how we transform this in recommendation for healthy diets, right? But for now, just a classification. The third group are traditional processed foods, things that we know for millennia, like bread, like cheese, and how the industry does this product, essentially by combining group 1 foods with one substance that belongs to the group 2. That is a substance that you have at home in your kitchen, right? So if you have a product, which is a food like cheese, milk, and then you have salt, or fruits in syrup, you have the fruit and have sugar. So in theory, you could do at home, right? So processed foods, we could, to simplify, say, are simple products that you could do at home, but you can buy from the industry. No. Everything which is not 1, 2, and 3 is 4 by definition in this case. But let's try it. So I could say the ultra-processed food, everything which is not unprocessed, minimal processed, processed ingredients, and processed food, right? But there are more. I mean, it's important to typify. Ultra-processed foods, first of all, they are not really modified foods. Processed foods like bread and cheese are modified foods. So you modify milk in a way that you have cheese. But in ultra-processed foods, there are formulations. They have usually many ingredients, and they are done with processed ingredients. That's why we call ultra-processed food, because they are processed food made from processed ingredients. Then you process food several times. And everything starts with the deconstruction of whole foods. So essentially, ultra-processed foods are products derived from the deconstruction of whole foods into parts, protein isolates, starches, oils, fats, modified starches. And all these substances that were obtained from foods were separated from foods, they are re-engineered again. They are recombined to make ultra-processed foods. But when you do this, of course, you break the food matrix, right? Because you have to separate all these components. And actually, most of these substances, like protein isolate or starches, they are tasteless. They don't have color. They don't have texture. They are not attractive. So that's why a key ingredient in ultra-processed foods are cosmetic additives. So you don't have an ultra-processed food without flavors, colorants, emulsifiers, and the other additives that are used to give to these products an appearance similar of that you find in whole foods, in culinary preparations. And what's the purpose of doing this? Because Nova is based on extent and purpose of food processing. Of course, ultra-processed foods are highly processed, right? They are processed several times. The end product of food ultra-processing is very difficult that you can link with the food. If you take, let's say, instant noodles, for instance, which is an ultra-processed food, it's done from what? It's not with flour. It's made from starch. It's made from oil. So oil from where? From corn, from soy. It doesn't matter because they are made with, let's say, macronutrients. They are formulation of macronutrients. And what's the purpose of doing ultra-processed foods? Essentially, is to replace all other foods. So with processed foods, you cannot have a diet, a complete diet only with processed food. You cannot eat bread and cheese in breakfast and lunch and dinner, right? But with ultra-processed foods, you can because you have alternatives in the market. In the US, I mean, in any country of the world, you can find for each food, for each culinary preparation, you can find an ultra-processed alternative. And why, and I'll show you in a moment, why people who are adopting more and more ultra-processed foods are replacing more and more traditional diet based on group 1, 2, and 3 by ultra-processed foods. Different attributes of ultra-processed foods are important. First of all, they have affordable prices. In general, they tend, in the US, it's typical. I mean, when you have an ultra-processed version of anything, a cookie, of a bread, anything, is cheaper than the traditional whole product. And why they are affordable? Because they are made with very cheap ingredients. Remember that I told you that they are made from oil, proteins, carbohydrates. And what are the sources of these components? Are the cheapest foods. So if you need protein, you go to soy. If you need oil, you go to corn. If you want sugar, you take also corn. If you need starch, you can take wheat grains. So they take in the market what is cheapest protein, the cheapest oil, the cheap carbohydrates. So that's why they can be sold at very low prices. And with this, they displace the actual foods because, I mean, the industry cannot make them cheap as ultra-processed foods. Convenience, they are all ready to eat. So you don't need to cook ultra-processed food. They are completely ready to eat. So they are convenient. And remember that I told you that there are formulations. So how much sugar and fat you put in one ultra-processed product? Exactly the combination that maximize palatability. So they are engineered in a way that people cannot resist. And if you take the advertisement of ultra-processed food, it's typical, you see, you cannot resist. You cannot take just one. It is true, because they are done. Some people say that real food is made by cooks, right? Ultra-processed food is made by engineers and psychologists. Psychologists that can understand what people like, what make people excited about food. And the engineers, they make this a reality by combining, by formulating the exact proportion. And additives are particularly important for this. And marketing. And if you take the TV or any other media and you see food ads, you see that 99% are ultra-processed foods. And why is that? Because they are highly profitable. Investing in marketing is very expensive. I mean, you cannot invest in marketing if you don't have profit margins, huge profit margins. So then you have a vicious circle because you have profits are invested in marketing, and marketing increases consumption, and so on. Well, but the definition, particularly of ultra-processed food, is complex because it takes into account several attributes of ultra-processed foods. To make simpler the identification of ultra-processed foods, because Nova was developed to make studies possible, to make possible epidemiological studies. So then we decided we would need something very simple, that in any part of the world, a person classifying foods will classify the same way. Then Nova proposed two types of markers of food ultra-processing. One are these food substances of exclusive industrial use, like protein isolates, gluten, different types of sugars, modified starches, etc., and the group of cosmetic additives. So these classes of additives that are used to impart sensory properties to the group that are not there due to their ingredients. Based on these UPF markers, we have some cell phone apps today. This is just one example with thousands or millions of products, actually. And it's mostly in Europe. But I mean, by reading barcodes, you can classify people in the supermarket. They can use the barcodes and classify Nova or products in 1, 2, or 3 class. Another important attribute of ultra-processed foods is the fact that most of these products are manufactured by transnational corporations. And this is not a coincidence, because these transnational corporations are those that have the condition to do at least 2 things. First of all, to buy the commodities that are used in the ultra-processed food, because essentially ultra-processed foods are formulation of commodities, oils, fats, and starches, and sugars. You buy in New York, in Amsterdam, in Jakarta, and you buy for the cheapest price. And if you have a small industry, you are not able to do this. I mean, you have to buy what you have in your market. Second, the industry, the food ultra-processing includes sophisticated equipments, sophisticated ingredients, flavors, for instance. I mean, you don't buy flavor in a supermarket. I mean, few companies in the world, it's a very sophisticated industry that produce flavors. So then again, you have to be big to have access to these foods. And why this is important? Because these transnational corporations, the global sales of these corporations per day is about $1 billion. So this means that they have the ability not just satisfy the demand, but they can create demand. I mean, when you have this amount of resources, you can create demand for your products. Again, another important difference from ultra-processed foods. Well, let's go to data. Here you have an idea. This is a very recent, this is for a paper that was not published. You can have an idea of the, not consumption, but sales, right? So it's a proxy of consumption. Kilograms or liters of ultra-processed products, going from baked products to soft drinks, so several products in the world. Now, the leader in this list is the US, where we have 380 kilograms of ultra-processed products consumed per year, meaning more than that one average American consume about 1 kilogram of these products per day. And this goes until India, where still have 11 kilograms per year of ultra-processed products. And then you have a big variation. In general, countries more on the left side of these slides are low and middle income countries. So what is happening right now is that these companies are targeting low and middle income countries because in these low and middle income countries, you have a window of opportunity, right? You have a possibility to expand these the consumption of these products. And in this slide, you see that they are succeeding. So you see that there are some increase in US and Western Europe, but increases much faster in countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. This is for foods. These are for ultra-processed drinks. Well, that's a general picture. But now let's see how NOVA has been used, particularly to study the relationship between diet and health. First of all, NOVA was proposing, not NOVA, but the concept of ultra-processed food was proposed in 2009. Then 2009, there was one paper using the term ultra-processed food before zero, right? So it took some time for other groups in the world starting to use NOVA. But the last 4 or 5 years, there was sort of epidemic of papers using NOVA, right? So exponential growth, literally exponential growth. And now what I will summarize for you this literature of the use of NOVA. So first of all, NOVA has been used to describe food processing based dietary patterns. So instead of define dietary patterns based on nutrients, the idea is to define based on the 4 NOVA food groups. Here you can see, for instance, that while in Portugal, Group 1 and Group 2, which is more or less correspond to freshly prepared dishes, right? So it goes to more than 50% of energy intake. If you take the UK, you have 57% of energy intake only from ultra-processed food. So very different dietary patterns, right? In Portugal, people still cook. Of course, they have some processed foods, traditional bread and cheese is very common in Portugal, and some ultra-processed food, 22%. Brazil, US, more or less the same situation. While in Brazil, most energy comes from Group 1 and 2. In the US, most from Group 4. And here, this is still more interesting because when you see the average energy intake in the US is about 57, 58%. It's increasing. So probably now is already 60 or maybe more. But if you divide the US population in quintiles, if I take the 20% lowest consumers of ultra-processed food, which is a lot, 20%, millions and millions of people, is the figure on our left side. So you see that most energy intake comes still from unprocessed, minimally processed, and processed culinary ingredients. And 32% from ultra-processed food is huge, but it's not most of the calories. But if you go to the other side, when I'm focused on the 20% highest UPF consumers, then you see 80% of calories. So almost everything comes from ultra-processed food. Well, now see directly the effect of these patterns, consuming more or less ultra-processed food, more or less fresh prepared dishes and meals, and diet quality and disease, right? The epidemiological studies. Before this, this is the main metric used to apply NOVA to a dietary data set is the UPF dietary share, which is the sum of all ultra-processed products, regardless of the type, divided by total intake in grams or kilocalories. I'll present more systematic reviews and meta-analysis right now. So I'll start with these meta-analysis of national data surveys conducted in 13 countries, including US, many other countries. And here you can see that each line corresponds to one country in this case. And you can see in general, what you see is that as UPF share increases, you have an increase in energy intake, an increase in saturated fats, an increase in added sugar, a decrease in fiber, protein, and potassium. This is the perfect recipe for chronic diseases, right? You could not invent anything better if you want to increase chronic diseases. But it's not just that. The magnitude of change is very important. I mentioned that it was a meta-analysis. So taking these 13 countries together, the study predict what would be the percentage free sugar in the diet if my diet has 15% of ultra-processed foods, 9.6. If I go to 75%, almost 20%. So we really are dealing with big difference, right? So in other words, in the US, that's the situation of the US. This is the meta-analysis. If in the US, I take the 20% lowest consumers of ultra-processed foods, they don't eat excessive sugar. They don't have excess. So it's possible. Some people are really not consuming ultra-processed food as the most of their calories and are not taking excessive amount of sugar. Fiber is the reverse, 13 to 9. So it's huge, the difference. We are not talking about 1 or 2 point percentage. The other important thing this study revealed was the fact that the more ultra-processed food in the diet, the less everything, but particularly less fruits, less vegetables, less legumes. Again, a good recipe for chronic disease, right? So you have not only the wrong nutrients, but you don't have the right foods. I don't need a slide. This is the same analysis just for children and adolescents, because what I showed before was a national dietary service that involved children and adults. Here we have only studies on children and adolescents showing the same thing. And this is a very interesting study based on Enhanced study. And it was studied the association between having more or less ultra-processed foods in the diet and the healthy eating index. As you know, the healthy eating index is the metric used to measure the adherence to that dietary guidelines in the US, right? So a higher healthy eating index means people are following the dietary recommendation, and the reverse is true. So look this, if you go for the first quintile to the upper quintile, the healthy eating index for adults goes from about 58 to 42. So it's a big difference. The same thing for children. So by taking all the studies in consideration, it looks very clear that the more ultra-processed food means the diet quality is worse. But what about effect on disease? We are interested to see if consuming more it's very likely, right? So seeing this, I expect some health problems related to ultra-processed food consumption. This is done particularly using cohort studies. So cohort studies are the gold standard for observational studies to study diet and health. You need to follow 20,000, 30,000, 100,000 people for 8, 10 years and see, depending on people consuming more of this on that, what's the risk of developing chronic disease that take time to develop. Between 2019 and 2022, there were 14 systematic reviews on UPF. I lost this because now it's about 20. So I decided not to monitor more because it's almost every month we have a different systematic review. But what I will show to you today is data that nobody saw before because we are doing this for a paper for the Lancet. So what we did was a systematic review of all the literature on UPF and disease. And we took the 14 health outcomes for which we have at least 3 good quality prospective studies, right? So there are more diseases related to ultra-processed foods, but I would say these are really strong evidence of association. We start with all-cause mortality. For all-cause mortality, there are 9 cohort studies in France, in Spain, UK, in the US, in Brazil, in China, in many countries. When you put together the 9, this is the, let's say, the gold standard for observational studies, that meta-analysis. When you put together these 9 studies, you see that the summary relative risk is 1.20. Means that people that have high consumption of ultra-processed food, they have 20% higher risk of premature mortality. We're talking here about premature mortality. The same thing for diabetes. There are 8 studies. 39% higher risk of having diabetes than a person with low consumption. And then CVD, overweight, obesity, hypertension, stroke, one cancer, colorectal cancer, coronary heart disease, Crohn's disease, abdominal obesity, cancer mortality, chronic kidney disease, and depression. Depression is probably now 3 studies. There are more probably already published. But in any case, this gives an idea that ultra-processed food is not just increasing obesity, that's a good thing, right? Because obesity is more or less the obvious chronic disease. But this is related to several diseases which have in common the fact that they are caused by a state of chronic inflammation. So it looks that the consumption of ultra-processed food, due to different mechanisms, effect on the microbiota and different things, they cause a state of a chronic inflammation that is underlying many or maybe all of these diseases. But okay, talking about causality, some people like to say, no, this is association, is not causation. And so sometimes they say this like associations. Garbage, I mean, that's that. But we know that what's important is totality of evidence. I mean, one single randomized or control trial in 20 people doesn't mean anything if you don't replicate the same findings in a large population, right? So we need both. We need the observational studies, the cohort studies, and it's very good when you can confirm with a randomized or control trial, particularly with crossover like this NIH trial. I'm sure most of you know this study. It was Kevin Hall did the study. He put 20 people in a hospital, and 10 of them, they eat a diet with 83% of ultra-processed food, almost everything ultra-processed food. 2 weeks, the second 2 weeks, they moved to a diet with 0 ultra-processed foods. And the other 10 people, they did the reverse. And then you compare a person with the arm person in the 2 diets. So this is the sort of a gold standard for trials. Just to give you an idea about what they had to eat, they were in a hospital. They only could eat this, and they should eat, they were advised to eat it as much as they want. This is an example of what was an ultra-processed menu for breakfast in one of the days. The other diet with 0 ultra-processed foods, 1 lunch in one situation, the other situation, 1 dinner. And they had in the room, they had snacks to eat along the day. And they, as I said, they were advised to eat as much as they want, okay? So what was the result? When a person was in the ultra-processed diet for 14 days, compared with an arm person in the non-ultra-processed diet, what was the energy intake? A difference of about 500 kilocalories. 500 kilocalories is huge. It's huge. It's about at least 20-25% of what we need the energy per day. But then you are really eating too much, right? In the 14 days, remember that each day they have a different menu. So it was not important if it was Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, always comparing the two, you have these 400, 500 kilocalories. And as a result of this is obvious, when people were in the ultra-processed diet, they got at the end of 14 days about 1 kilogram, and they lost 1 kilogram when they were in the other. So this is a very elegant demonstration of the relationship between UPF and energy intake. Of course, it's still not obesity because just 1 kilogram, but it shows what we expected. And most were fat mass. There are a third aspect to discuss causality, which are important. So the first one, I have strong, well-conducted cohort studies, prospective studies. Cross-sectionals, not so good. I mean, just an initial thing, but then you need prospective studies. If you have a randomized controlled trial, it's still better, but there's one missing piece, which is the mechanism. It's important to identify why A is related to B, I mean, what's going on between A and B. And these are mechanistic studies. So for what I showed to you up to now, it's clear that there are two mechanisms, at least, well demonstrated to explain these associations. The first one is the imbalanced nutrients in the diet, at the diet level. So people eating more ultra-processed food, they have more sodium, more trans fat, saturated fat, less fiber, et cetera, et cetera. And also, it well demonstrates that the ultra-processed food, they displace healthy foods like fruits and vegetables, for instance. But the question is, are these the only mechanism? If they were, it would be important, even if it was just these two mechanisms that are very well known. Well, the evidence, this question was asked by these two authors in a review they did of, at that point, 37 cohort studies relating UPF with some disease. And what they did, they simply analyzed the studies before adjustment of the association between PF and disease for dietary nutrient profile and healthy foods like fruits and vegetables. And they observe what happened with the adjustment. With the adjustment, the association disappeared. Then you could say, well, everything is related to nutrients and the displacement of healthy foods. But what they observed was not that. Consistent across many studies, adjustment for fat, sugar, sodium intake, or adjustment for adherence to a range of healthy or unhealthy dietary patterns has a minimal impact on the adverse association between UPF and diverse range of health-related outcomes. So in sum, there are more than nutrients and there are more than displacement of healthy foods. And this Italian study did a still more interesting study to respond to this question. I mean, ultra-processed food is just a matter of eating too much sodium, saturated fat, etc., or there are more than that. So what they did, they took Italian cohorts called Molisani, and they divided the participants of the cohort according to the consumption of UPF, taking the lowest consumers, intermediate, and highest consumers, and they compare the increasing UPF intake with the risk of all these outcomes: mortality, all-cause, cardiovascular, cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And they did the same thing for a score, which is based essentially sodium, saturated fat intake, fruits and vegetables, which is the score actually that you use it for the Nutri-Score, the European system to classify foods according to nutrients, essentially, and the presence of healthy foods. So if you see this, it's quite clear that in the left side for UPF, you have, except for cancer, but in all the other outcomes, you have a dose-response association. More UPF, higher risk of mortality, cardiovascular, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the right, it does look dose-response, right? So take the first one. First quartile is the reference one, and then there's some decrease, some increase. If you compare the lowest consumers, the highest, you have a significant, but you don't have those response, right? So just by looking these two figures, you realize that, look, the food processing is more important than the explanation about this nutrient. But then they did more. They did another model where they put together the two exposures, the exposure to UPF and the exposure to this score that measure nutrient profile. And what they concluded was that the adjustment of UPF intake association by this nutrient profile model doesn't change almost the same thing that was found in the previous study. But when they did the reverse, when they took the Nutri-Score exposure and they adjust for ultra-processed food intake, the association didn't disappear, but they lost 25% of the strength. So this means that part of the effect of the Nutri-Score, say, on disease, on outcomes, was actually mediated by the consumption of ultra-processed food. In other words, ultra-processed food was confounding the association between the Nutri-Score and these health outcomes. So it's quite interesting because at the beginning, when you have the first studies on ultra-processed food, I remember people saying, no, this is just because people are eating too much sugar or too much energy density. So this is not anything to do with which is absurd because, of course, if you have higher content of sugar, it's because someone put the sugar there, right? So if you don't call this food processing, I don't know what's food processing, right? But they were wrong because actually it's the opposite. And actually, I remember that I was presenting this in Japan recently. And then one person asked this, well, but then we need to review all the studies that relate to sugar, sodium, trans fat, saturated fat, and health outcomes adjusting for UPF? I say, yes, we do. Because part of this effect maybe are the additives in the ultra-processed food. Maybe they don't have anything with sugar or sodium. Not everything, of course, as in this case, I told you, 25% of the effect was ultra-processed. The 75% still is sodium, sugar, etc. Well, and the Kevin Hall trial actually confirmed this. I didn't say this before, but the 20 participants that were in the two diets were matched according to fiber, according to sugar, according to, of course, calories they presented, and macronutrients. So then Kevin Hall, actually, I don't know if you saw some interview with Kevin Hall, but he said when he decided to do this, because he said, well, this NOVA is one of the most, I'd say he used a term, weakest, concept. This is no science. This is no science. I will do a trial to demonstrate this because then I will match the two diets according to fiber, sugar, and there won't be any effect. So then it's not food ultra-processing, it's fiber, etc. He was wrong because actually fiber is not there because someone took fiber from there. And who did this? The processing. So it's processing. Of course, we are talking about mediation, which is another thing. But then he was surprised at me when he saw that, and he said, I was wrong. So that's interesting. Scientists in general, they don't recognize this. But if it's not sodium and saturated fat, energy density, fruits and vegetables, what are the mechanisms? What we can have in ultra-processed food, which are not nutrients, are not these healthy foods? Here, I could talk about 1 hour about this. Are mechanisms for which there are some evidence that they exist. Starting with reduced phytochemicals. Remember that I told you that foods, they have nutrients, but they have much more other food components. And these food components are destroyed by definition. If you take phytochemicals, if you separate the food into carbohydrates, protein, and fat, you lose the phytochemicals. They are not there in the final product. And then you have reduced water intake, phthalates, acrylamide, emulsifiers. That all of these have some evidence showing that they are present in ultra-processed foods and they cause some health problems. And the final one is quasi-addictive properties, which is a very interesting area of research. The pro-inflammatory gut microbiota is also very, very interesting. And if we put this evidence in one graphic, we could say that increased ultra-processed food consumption increase the risk of disease through different mechanisms. It is very likely that depending on the outcomes, cancer or diabetes or obesity or Crohn's disease, probably the mechanisms are different. And they are probably a combination of mechanisms for each of these diseases. But the question that I want to leave with you for discussion, do we need to know the exact combination of mechanisms that link UPF to each disease, 14 I showed to you before recommending for people to reduce or avoid its consumption and for policymakers to implement actions to make this feasible? Well, we think we have enough evidence. That's good. That's very important to do more research. Always we need more research, right? And this is an area where more research is clearly necessary. But the point is that with the evidence we have, with totality of evidence we have, we think that's important, at least in dietary guidelines, tell people to avoid consumption of ultra-processed foods until we have more research, more results. And particularly reformulation, because we have two types of reformulation. One reformulation, if you take let's say one ultra-processed cookie, and then you transform into a processed cookie. But to do this, what the industry has to do, they have to remove all flavors, all colorants. They have to, if it's an almond biscuit cookie, they have to use almonds. They cannot use flavors. So, but it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. But then it will cost 2-3 times more. And then the profits are lost. So that's why this is not that technologically is impossible. The fact is economically is not feasible to do this at least without regulation. But just to be clear, there are other people that think different, and Kevin Hall is one of them. He thinks reformulation is the way to go, and he has an argument. I mean, I accept. And he says, look, in the US, people consume 60% of energy intake of ultra-processed food. It's impossible to change this. I mean, we can change this only if you change the country. I mean, if you change everything. And since this is not possible, what I think we should do is try to identify what is wrong with ultra-processed foods. And by finding what is wrong, then you tell the industry, please remove this additive, because this is causing the whole problem. The question is there this single mechanism? Is this the single ingredient that you'll find? Well, I don't think so. And if you see all the disease, it's not just obesity. I mean, so it's very likely you don't have one single element that can be changed. But he has a point. I mean, is this feasible? Is this easy? No, it's not. Particularly when a country arrives in this situation. Well, just I'll finish with some more slides to tell you that NOVA is also being used to formulate dietary guidelines. Brazil was the first in 2014. Then you have some South America countries, Israel more recently, Malaysia. I would like to add the Nordic countries. They're almost there. Philippa is here. It was a nice systematic review that recommended that the Nordic guidelines, but it looks to be difficult to have this recommendation. But Mexico is in the list. Right? Mexico already have I should include Mexico here, and Chile also. And other countries are considering. Just to how we use it in 2014, how we use NOVA as a framework for dietary guidelines. So this is the Brazilian dietary guideline. In one chapter, which is chapter number 2, when we try to teach people how to choose foods to have a healthy diet at the end of the day. So the recommendation was very simple. 4 recommendations. First, base your diet in group 1 foods. A variety of them. Of course, you can just eat apples or tomatoes or rice. I mean, you have to combine all these foods, plant origin, agroecological production without environmental impact. But that was the main, and variation, the diversity. We are omnivorous, so human beings only can be fed if they fed different things, because we're selected in this way. So diversity is very important. What we said about group 2, using small amounts. we didn't say avoid using oil or salt or sugar. No, I mean, in the Brazilian culture, even sugar is part. I mean, how you can do a dessert at home if you don't use sugar, right? But the recommendation is that this always should be in minimum amounts, never can compete with group 1 foods. For processed food, the same thing, moderation in terms of quantities, and use this to complement the group 1 and group 2 and not to replace. And finally, ultra-processed food to avoid different reasons. I didn't mention this, but there are some important consequences. One is destruction of the food cultures. I mean, if you see, what people eat is part of the culture, right? And this makes one of the most important part of the culture. When these ultra-processed foods penetrate in one country, traditional diet, they disappear because they are actually manufactured to displace the traditional diet. Then you lose part of your culture. And then you have environment and other elements. And the golden rule is just very simple, always prefer unprocessed or minimal processed foods and freshly made dishes and meals to ultra-processed products. And then we have specific examples: do not replace water, milk, fruit by soft drinks, dairy drinks, biscuits, etc. This semi-orientation, avoidance or reduction of ultra-processed foods, you find the American Heart Association Dietary Guidance, a recent one from 2021. So they say, among other things, reduction in ultra-processed foods. This is another medical society of liver that recommend the same thing for liver diseases to avoid reduced ultra-processed food consumption. So NOVA has been used in research, has been used in dietary guidelines, and they start to be used in policy and programs, goals, and regulations. You see here the school meal program in Brazil, which provides food for 42 million children every day in Brazil. They are oriented by NOVA. So NOVA Group 1, base 2 and 3, small, avoid Group 4. In France, they have the country has a goal of reducing 20% the intake of ultra-processed food. So it was already, and this is the PAHO nutrient profile model, which is also based on NOVA. This is my final slide. Developments and improvements. What is new here? First of all, we see more cell phones. There's one cell phone app which is called Perfect. It will be very soon in the US, and they will work with the Amazon and all these other retailers. So people will be able to say, I want to buy foods, but I don't want any ultra-processed food. So then the system automatically, when they put the yogurt, they will provide all the brands that are not ultra-processed. So this will be interesting. Euromonitor sales, that the one I showed to you, the sales of ultra-processed products now is one indicator of the food system countdown to 2030 initiative. So it's going in this important system. We create a NOVA UPF score and validate it in Brazil. Now it's being validated in several countries. That is one questionnaire with 23 questions about consuming what in Brazil are the most common ultra-processed foods. So people respond in 2 minutes, yes or no, the day before. So by this very short questionnaire, we do a score, and we are testing this score for monitoring purpose. If you don't have time to do a long questionnaire, you can do one in 2 minutes. There are new food frequency questionnaires being done that take into account NOVA food group, because food frequency questionnaire can be very complicated if they mix NOVA groups. Then you don't know how you can distribute. And finally, we developed for one cohort we have in Brazil, Nutrinet Brazil cohort, we develop a web-based dietary recall that is entirely self-responded by participants. And after the person finishes the 24-hour recall, it takes about 15 minutes. immediately all the food items are classified according to group 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this will make much easier the application of course, these are types of tools that should be adapted for each country, because you have to take into account what people eat.